Take a minute and set up the page. Remember that you can pause this whenever you need to, so you can get your notes here. This is, what is today? 12-4. This is Unit 7. And this is Evolution 2. So remember that the first unit on evolution was just what's the evidence. And then the second one will be on how does it work. And the number one way it works is through this process of natural selection. So we're doing B7C. And B7C says that you're going to analyze and evaluate. So analyze and evaluate is all over the place when you do these things. When we have these takes. So analyze means you're looking for patterns. And evaluate means you're saying, okay, how good is this idea? Is it really the way it says it's going to be? What's going on with this? So analyze and evaluate specifically how natural selection produces change in populations, not individuals. It's not my birthday. Although if you want to bring me presents, you go ahead. May. Okay, so they have the whole teak just on this one thing. It's not happening in individuals, it's happening in populations. So it's not the individual organism that evolves. It's the population of organisms. So like we talked about yesterday with the guppies, you have those gray guppies. They're gray when they're in an environment that's predator rich. Lots of predators, they're going to be gray where they blend in, right? The minute you take those out and put them in a place where they're safe, where there aren't many predators, the colors show up. And it's not that that one gray guppy changes colors. It's that it has babies, and instead of the colorful babies immediately being eaten, they grow to adulthood, and then they can have offspring that have those more and more of those colors. So what we say is that the gene frequency in that group changes. So it's not that the colorful genes weren't there. They were there. They were more like recessive traits, right? Yeah. Or they could have even been dominant traits. But the fact is that they weren't showing up because they were being eaten. The babies had those traits, but those babies were eaten pretty quickly. Okay? All right. So there are a couple of phrases in here that we need to just focus on and talk about natural selection. And we're going to talk about natural selection more than one time here. So we're going to start this off here with natural selection. This would be as opposed to artificial selection, which you guys have no problems understanding. Artificial selection is when we humans jump in and we say, hey, I want that puppy to be spotted. Like, I have poodles, little toy little, I don't know whether they're little, really small poodles. And I bought my poodles, and when I bought them, I wanted one that was spotted because I thought they were cute. And so they have party colored because they're spotted, you know, not the solid color. So it's like, oh, we want the spotted ones, and here's the solid ones, and so on and so on. It's a characteristic that shows up. And when you find that characteristic that's spotted, the little spotted puppy that shows up, because, you know, if you go, you guys know what AKC, the American Kennel Association, AKA you can have your dogs certified, yeah? They have it show the pedigree. Well, the American Kennel Society, they don't like if you try to show a dog, if it's a poodle, it can have spots. That's like, no, we don't like those. We want solid colored poodles. So for the longest time, all the poodles were solid colored. And then someone who wasn't really paying attention, they came up with a mutation or some kind of thing that showed up, and they said, oh, it's spotted. And somebody thought, oh, those are the cutest puppies. And so the breeders were saying, hey, there's an idea. So they're registered, but if you were trying to breed show dogs, because show dogs, you can make a lot of money on that. Just like in ag, you can show cattle, things like that. You can do that with dogs too. Show dogs, they don't show them as spotted. They'll never do that. But they sell them to people like that, and they make a lot of money doing that. So it's just a characteristic that pops up, and we humans jump in and say, yeah, we like that, so let's breed more. So take that spotted dog and maybe get another spotted dog from someone else, poodles, and breed those, and we get spotted puppies over and over and over again. So that's artificial selection. Natural selection is the exact same thing, only it just happens naturally. Humans don't have to jump in and say, hey, let's do this here. Yeah? That's it. This is the theory that was put forth by Darwin. that explains how evolution works. It's the mechanism. I'm going to put that word in parentheses there, mechanism. How does it work? This is the mechanism, and that's exactly like we were talking about when with humans we jump in and we do the artificial selection. We are creating an evolutionary process. Maybe at some point in the future you're going to find that not all dogs can mate and have offspring with each other. I mean, especially when you think about the really large breeds like a Great Dane and a Chihuahua. Can you imagine if the Chihuahua has Great Dane puppies? It's going to kill the Chihuahua, right? I mean, just the puppies themselves are too big. They're usually born bigger than the Chihuahuas are, aren't they? So if we keep jumping in and kind of creating such extremes like that, at some point it might be that you get to a point where those two organisms can't mate and have offspring. Even if at this point probably that physically it'd be a problem, but even if you go on farther and keep it that way, it could be that again we choose characteristics that make them actually become a different species. They don't recognize each other. Now that would be way down the road sometime, because still evolutionary process is a long time thing, but still that's a possibility when you talk about that. So natural selection is a theory put forth by Darwin that explains how the evolutionary works, and there are 4 parts to it. Okay, 4 parts. 1, overpopulation occurs. Okay, this overpopulation that I'm talking about is the fact that organisms produce more offspring than can possibly survive. Again, did we talk about the baby turtles in here? Yeah, there's no way all those offspring can survive. Yep. Now, the difference between something like, let me spell this word right because apparently I'm having issues today. The difference between something like pigs and the turtles. Okay, so the turtles, the sea turtles, they have they lay all those thousands of eggs, and the little sea turtles, really try and work hard to get to the ocean, and most of them don't make it, right? They're eaten by something, by birds. There's a feast of for the birds that do that, and there are just so many organisms so many offspring that are produced that they overproduce the offspring. Are you listening? They overproduce the offspring on purpose. So they expend a lot of energy producing all these offsprings in realizing and not just consciously like the mother turtle does it say, okay, all my babies are going to die but 2. She doesn't recognize that, but naturally most of those offspring are going to die, and only a few are left. With domesticated animals, we humans have again stepped in. We want pigs to produce a lot of offspring because we love bacon, right? We love ham, we like all that good stuff, so we purposely produce those and choose for those pigs that put out a lot of offspring, a lot of healthy offspring, and then we raise them. We step in and make sure those offspring don't die. We make sure that they have plenty of food, that they're taken care of and fattened up so that we can use them later. Yeah, exactly we do. Yeah, even if you talk about cattle, anything where the humans step in, we control the population. We want them to have the population, a lot of babies, but then we also kill those. Once they get a certain size, they don't breed. We have steers, yes? They're not going to breed. They are specifically raised for food. And so we have these pigs in a similar sense. They're not going to breed, they're going to be used for food. And so we humans step in and do that. In the natural realm of things, we humans are not stepping in and doing that. This is just what naturally occurs on its own. So the first step is always going to be overpopulation. They're going to be producing a lot more babies that can actually survive. There just aren't enough resources for them. The second thing is you have variation. Are all the babies going to be exactly alike? No, there's going to be variation. Now, for my purposes, if I'm talking mice again, they all look the same to me. All those little mice, if this mouse has a litter of 6 baby mice, I'm looking at them and thinking, yeah, they all look the same. In reality, even though for my eyes those little baby mice look the same, there are going to be variations between them. Maybe it's something that we couldn't possibly see, like one of them is able to smell a little bit better. They have a better sense of smell. One of them might have a better sense of sight. One of them might be able to move faster or jag back and forth faster. Those are characteristics, those are traits also. So variation occurs, and when I say this, we're talking about gene variations. Now you're going to have to dredge back in your memory and look through stuff, and remember that when we talk about genes, all of your traits, your variations are coded for by genes, and so there are differences within those. There are, and a lot of times we say, oh, well, it's for your eye color, you have a big B and a little b, for brown eyes and maybe a recessive gene for blue eyes. You realize it's not just one set of genes that makes your eye color, right? Because think about the fact that there are different shades of brown. If it were just one set of genes, like, brown eyes or blue eyes or whatever, then they would all be the exact same shade of brown, right? And they're not. If you look at people's eyes, just in brown eyes, there are all sorts of shades and ranges of the browns that are there. So there's a lot more than just one set of genes that code for anything. Same way with anything else, your sense of smell, all those things. You have tons of genes that come together and code and make these things. So variations and gene variations can occur. And so those little bitty bits of variations can cause changes that are significant. So one set of brown eyes is almost black. Another set of brown eyes is a real pale brown, and you can see little darker flecks in it. Yeah, differences. And sometimes those differences are significant in how they survive. Not necessarily humans, because we control everything, but other organisms can do that. So we're going to have variation that occurs. The third one is the struggle for survival. I'm going to give you two phrases that you've heard before. Yep. There you go. Struggle for survival. And that's the other one. These are two phrases that Darwin came up with. So the struggle for survival and the survival of the fittest. So these were in his book. And those phrases are talking about the fact that they're not necessarily fighting each other, although, obviously that can happen. But in reality, when we're talking about this, we're not focused on them fighting each other. We're really focused on them struggling to get to the resources. So struggling is the struggle to get to resources. Because there's a set amount of resources. I mean, if it's humans jumping in and doing it, we grow food for these animals, right? We grow hay for the cattle because there's not enough grass out there where we have them pinned in. But if it's just nature, then there's a finite, definite, set amount of resources. The struggle to get the resources that are finite. Do you guys know what that word finite means? Limited, yeah. So the resources are limited. There's a set amount of resources that are out there. And so they're struggling to get to those resources. So we have a struggle for survival. And then there is some variation. When we say this survival of the fittest, there is some variation that allows one organism to survive better than another. Maybe it's a set of variations. Maybe it's one. They can get to the resources better. Maybe it's that they have a tiny little bit higher metabolism or lower metabolism, and they can survive on less food. Maybe it's that. But there's going to be some variation that allows one organism to survive better than another. And they are going to pass that variation on. That's number 4. Those that survive enough to reproduce. So those that survive pass that variation on to their offspring. That variation that enabled them to survive is going to show up more and more and more in the population. That's called an increase or a change in the gene frequency. So that variation shows up more in the population, and we call that a change in gene frequency. How frequently does that particular trait or gene that causes that trait show up? Okay, have you guys heard the word allele? Yes? Allele? A-L-E, there's two E's in there somewhere, two L's in there somewhere. A-L-L-E-L-E? Yeah. So that's another word for gene. When we talk about genes, we can take out the word gene, stick in the word allele. So the gene frequency changes or the allele frequency changes. So it's not that there's some mutation necessarily that happens. They're slow, little bitty tiny things. This is gradual evolution. This is not some crazy punctuated evolution where, wow, something weird happens. This is the gradual stuff. So the gene shows up more often, and it shows up, and the gene frequency changes. And as it changes, as that particular gene shows up, a lot of times you lose some of the past genes that were there. And so slowly the population changes. And when I say slowly, remember we're dealing in hundreds of thousands of years for that to occur, right? Yep. Okay. So all within this, running through this, is the fact that it's not the individual that evolves. The individual organism doesn't evolve. Yeah. Okay, so that individual organism doesn't evolve. The population evolves. Thank you. And so that's what they're really focused on. So you have to know what natural selection is, but understand that natural selection is occurring not on an individual basis. The whole process, these steps 1 through 4, happens within that whole process happens within the population. Yeah, individuals can die, and so the ones that are individually not best adapted to the environment are going to die off. But you're looking to see what happens to the overall population, not the individual organism. It could be that the individual organism, accidentally had a branch fall on it. Not because it wasn't adapted enough, but because just accidents happen. So you look at the overall population for this to happen. Now, populations can evolve in 3 different ways. And we call them 3 directions, I guess you could say. 3 directions, 3 ways. And the first one's called stabilizing selection. So, natural selection, right? So this is stabilizing selection. It's a form of natural selection. All of these are going to be natural selection. Do you guys know what a bell curve is? Yes, no? Ish. You've heard of it, you're not quite sure what they're talking about? Okay, so if you draw a simple graph, and you're going to draw one of these in just a minute, a bell curve is just the simple standard where you have a certain number on the ends and a certain number on each end. Here's your 50% right here. The vast majority of the population will be right here in the mid-range, and then you have the extremes. Yes, if this were an IQ or an intelligence bell graph, you guys would probably be right over here, yeah? A little bit above average? Yes? Yeah, so there would be you on the bell curve. So average would be like 90 to 110 IQ, and you'd be over here a little bit. So that's a typical bell curve. You can fit pretty much anything. If you have a big enough population, pretty much anything will make a nice bell curve here. Yeah? All right, so we're going to start with the bell curve. So with stabilizing selection, what happens is it eliminates the natural selection that's happening, eliminates the extremes. Okay, you're going to need, let me pull this up here. You're going to need 2 colors. So let's make a graph here. And here's my bell curve. Right? Here's my bell curve. You might need to practice on your bell curve a little bit. If I have a stabilizing selection, it's kind of like taking the ends of it and scrunching the whole thing up. So instead of having so many things on the ends, on the extremes, you get a curve that's more like this. So the vast majority of the population will now be in the middle. So it's just taking it and scrunching it up. So this is stabilizing. It all goes towards the middle. Fewer extremes, more in the middle. We talked about skin color in humans. If we pop back in, 300 years in the future, we're going to find that we have less extremes in colors of skin and more so towards the middle. Because as the human population just moves, we're very, very mobile, then we have interrelation, and we have interreactions between different colors of people more and more, because more acceptable, things like that. And so you just have that more often. It'll take a while, but it'll probably happen. Any of you guys read sci-fi, fantasy? Sci-fi usually does this. But sci-fi, when they talk about, ooh, this is going to be what it's like in the future, every sci-fi book you pick up in the future talks about the color. They'll talk about mixed race, because the vast majority of people, as you go 200-300 years in the future, you get that's going to happen. It doesn't mean the ends are eliminated, it just means that it goes more towards a stabilizing. And that's just basic evolution. You have a stabilizing factor in the population. So if we talked about, let's say you had those mice again, and you had these little bitty tiny mice, and you have the really big mice, and they're in the same population, same species. If it's a stabilizing selection, natural selection is just stabilizing, you won't have those extremes. Fewer of the organisms will be on the extremes, more of them will be the average. Yes? You get that? Okay, so that's stabilizing. The next one is directional selection. Just the opposite of stabilizing. I'm sorry, it's not just the opposite, but it's got some part in there. This goes towards one extreme or the other. So it's going to make it go towards one extreme or the other. So I'm going to draw my next one up here. And here's my bell curve. Okay, that's my original bell curve. And in this case, my curve is it's going to change to be over here or over here. So it's like they're selecting for the extremes, one or the other. Something in the environment makes it go towards this extreme. So those little bitty tiny mice, you'd have a lot more smaller mice than you have the average or bigger size. That's directional selection. So it's going to it'll be in this direction towards the smaller in my mice example, or towards the larger on the other side here. So it'll be one or the other. Maybe it's the big mice that are selected for because the bigger ones are better able to survive, or maybe it's the little mice that are selected for because the littler ones are able to survive better. But it'll be one or the other. That's directional. You need to tell me if you're not understanding what I'm talking about. If I need to give you a different example, be sure and tell me about this, because this is kind of a different thing than what you've studied in other classes too. Okay? So always ask questions if you have them. Thinking, hey, I didn't quite get that, because if you didn't quite get it, somebody else didn't get it either. So be sure and ask questions. Okay, and the last one is disruptive. Disruptive selection. And in disruptive selection, it goes towards both extremes. So there's no medium. There's no in the middle. It's one end or the other. So in this one, okay, so I'm going to draw my bell curve, my standard bell curve again, right? So in this one, the graph looks like this. Do you see the difference between these two graphs? Yeah? Okay. So in this one, it's going to be one end or the other. Here, you have both extremes, but almost no one in the middle. So this one is disruptive. And then this one is directional. And what's interesting is these two, see these two right here? these two are typically the ones that lead to evolution. If it's directional, you're going towards one end or the other, and they're very, very different from the original ones that started out, right? And if that continues to happen, slowly over those hundreds of thousands of years, that's going to change. It's going to create a new species. Same way with these two right here, this one right here, you're going to actually end up with two new species right here. Instead of one species just kind of moving in and changing altogether, here it looks like you might have two new species develop, and they can branch off from that, yeah? What happens if what do we call it when one of the species dies out? Extinction. So the last word I want you to make sure that you put on here, and I don't think you'll need to study this too much because most of you guys are familiar with this word, extinction. I'm putting it on here specifically so that you know, you better make sure you know this. This is when the species dies out. If we have it in directional, it'll be one or the other. So let's say it goes towards the left here, then this original species will die out because it evolves into this one. It's not that there was this massive die out, it's that it changed so much. So when you ultimately compare what you have here to what you had originally, they're not the same species. Here again in the disruptive one, the original species that was kind of in the central area dies out, and you end up having two new species at the extremes. So it's not that we think about the mass extinction of the dinosaurs where, the meteorite or whatever it was hit and, massively changed the environment. We think a lot of times extinction and we think of that immediately, but in reality it's just the fact that the genes slowly change over time, and what the original thing was is no longer. And so if you took what you have now and compared to that, then it's no longer there. Okay? All right. Let me stop this.